We'll call the April 25th, 2018 Planning and Zoning Commission meeting to order at 6:01 p.m. For the record, Commissioner Ray is absent. Next item on the agenda is our hearing of residents. Do we have anybody signed up? All right, we do have one person that is signed up for the hearing of residents. So we have a Brian Cullen signed up. Is this going to be for the public hearing or? Okay. He'll also have an opportunity to speak when we do the public hearing on your specific request, so it's probably better that we just let him speak then. Okay. Next item on the agenda will be our consent agenda, minutes for the March 28th, 2018 regular meeting. Any comments or questions, revisions?
Mr. Chairman, I've got a couple questions about the minutes, so I would ask or move that they be pulled off the consent agenda and open for discussion.
All right, we have a motion to pull the minutes off the consent agenda. Second. A second by Mr. Evans. All right, I'll call for a vote.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye. All right, motion carries 6-0. All right, Mr. Outlaw.
Well, again, I apologize. It's probably another one of those educational things, and it's not new. I'm sure we've been doing this for a while, but when I get to the minutes in number 3 consent agenda, there were 3 items on the consent agenda, but we only took 1 vote. And I'm just curious, but you know, from reading the minutes, it would appear that we voted on each and every one of these individually. And I'm just curious as to why we do that, since that's not really what we did.
I guess procedurally, anything that is on the consent agenda, we consider as one item. And that's why we also have the opportunity for if somebody wants to pull an item for individual consideration, we can do so. In terms of our actions, anything that we approve on the consent agenda as a unit is binding, and I guess in some respects it's also done for the sake of expediencies for items that are considered to be non-controversial in the opinion of staff when they're putting it together.
Well, and I understand that, Mr. Chairman, but you know, when you read through here, for instance, in the minutes under item B, Mr. Greenwald motioned to approve PC 2016-017. Mr. Ray seconded the motion. The vote was 7-0. Motion carried. Okay. He didn't make that motion. The motion was to approve the consent agenda. And yet we're showing 3 separate votes on those items under the consent agenda.
Okay, I see what you're saying, yes. I believe we can just modify that on our minutes and bring that back at the next one, and we'll do it that way going forward.
Well, unless there's a valid, you know, I'm really asking unless there's a valid reason for doing it that way. I don't know. There's not. Okay.
Yeah, I think it's just kind of a carryover of the process. They just do an individual motion and vote recordation of every item that we do, and just the consent agenda just kind of got caught up in that. And
yeah, Mr. Chairman, I would concur with his comments. That would be the better way to do it, is reflect the actual vote on the full consent agenda and list those items in the minutes.
And I would agree with that. So let's modify those and then bring those minutes back to our next meeting then for our final approval. All right, that takes care of the consent agenda. We have a couple of items here. Well, we need to modify it. Need to modify it.
With the modifications, or are you going to wait to see it?
Okay, yeah, I guess bring them back. Yeah.
Okay.
All righty then. Are they ready to proceed? Yes? Okay. All right, next item on the agenda is items for individual consideration. Item 4A, WA 2018-002. Consider and act upon a request for approval of a waiver regarding on-site sewage facilities for proposed lots 2, 3, and 4 of the Cullen subdivision, an approximate 6-acre tract of land located at 6302 Fowle Road, about 3,500 feet north of the intersection of Fowle Road and Interstate 10, City of Schertz, Bexar County. Tannery.
Good evening, Commissioners. The applicant, or there are two applicants. The applicants are requesting a waiver associated with a proposed replat of the Cullen subdivision. The waiver being requested is a waiver to Unified Development Code Section 21.15.3b, which requires that all lots proposed to be developed shall be connected to a public wastewater system. Excuse me. Compliance with this UDC section would require extension of the sewer line from the nearest available sewer to the subject property so that development on the proposed lots would be able to tie into our public wastewater system. The applicant is requesting a waiver so that rather than tying to the public wastewater system available, the lots could instead install an on-site septic system for each of the lots being proposed. UDC section 21.12.15 grants your Planning and Zoning Commission the authority to grant waivers when undue hardship will result from requiring strict compliance with UDC requirements. The applicant's justification for the waiver request is based on the significant amount of sewer extension that would be required if they were to tie into and connect to the existing available public wastewater system. The closest connection point is off I-10, which is about 3,500 feet away. This exhibit here that the project engineer submitted shows where the Cullen replat site is, and then the red line shows where the extension would have to occur, traversing all the way down along Fowle Road, down to the closest sewer main available, which is off I-10. And again, that's about 3,500 feet away. Due to spacing requirements between manholes, the project engineer estimated that in addition to the sewer extension that would be required, about 9 manholes would also have to be installed if the property owner is required to connect to the existing public sewer system. Additionally, potentially easements across numerous private tracts of land may also have to be obtained from different property owners surrounding the subject site. The project engineer submitted an estimated cost associated with sewer extension and connection that is over $360,000, and the waiver request was submitted along with the replat application for staff to review. Engineering department reviewed it and provided a memo indicating that engineer supports granting of the waiver that is being requested, and staff recommends approval.
Right. Commissioners, comments, questions?
Is this area included in the Schertz's plan to cover the southern region with waste sewer collection systems?
Well, we actually have our city engineer here, so no, it's not.
It's not.
So this property is west of 1518, and I believe the majority of the areas that would be serviced by the sewer is east of FM 1518, predominantly, in some portions.
So the wastewater projects that are currently in our master plan don't really get near this area. The Woman Hollering Creek wastewater line will serve everything pretty much on the east side of 1518 and the Crossvine, and kind of a line down from the Crossvine south from the west side of 1518, but not this far west. This is actually, I believe, in the CCN, so it would ultimately flow to that location. Just as an update, aside from this project, we will be embarking on updated water and wastewater master plans in the coming months, and so out of that, we'll have much more information about future and priorities as far as expanding our system.
I'll look forward to that.
Me too.
We typically have these waivers, and it's the verbiage is a little bit different. I just wanted to clarify something on this. In the section where it says public improvements, it says the applicant is seeking approval of a waiver to not extend and connect to public wastewater. My understanding is it's always been policy that if and when sewer is extended out to that area and the septics fail, that the properties will be required at that time to connect to sewer. And just want to make sure that we're still maintaining that policy.
Sorry. So we are still maintaining that policy. The Code of Ordinances actually has some provisions that talks about certain distances that align when it comes to within that distance of a structure it needs to tie on. We're also looking to, Public Works is looking to update that code section to include some language that has a timetable for the connection. The general policy is when your septic system fails, you tie on. Other municipalities have time limits, like when the septic system fails or within 10 years. So we're looking to tighten up that language a little bit to make it more clear. But the policy is still to connect once the sewer's in closer proximity.
We need to check state law on that too, because it's one of the reasons for the change was that when it failed, state says you must hook up.
Right.
And Mr. Dalla, the reason the language is a little different is as we were reviewing our staff report, we wanted to make sure, with new commissioners as well, we wanted to make sure that the commission is aware that the waiver is not to allow for septic, but the waiver is really a waiver from the requirement to tie into the public wastewater system, which then the outcome of that is by not tying into the public wastewater system, it enables the on-site system. So it's a slight difference in the language, but we just wanted to make sure that the commission is aware the waiver is for the public wastewater system connection requirement, not a waiver for the septic.
Mr. Chairman, I'll make a motion that we approve request for approval of a waiver regarding on-site sewage facilities, WA 2018-002.
Okay, I have a motion by Commissioner Outlaw. Do I have a second?
Second.
Second by Mr. Greenwald. Any other comments or questions? All right, call for a vote.
Aye.
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 Aye. All right, motion carries 6-0. Next item on the agenda, public hearing, 5A, PC 2018-002. Hold a public hearing, consider and act upon a request for approval of a replat for the Cullen subdivision, an approximate 6-acre tract of land located at 6302 Fowle Road, about 3,500 feet north of the intersection of Fowle Road and Interstate 10, City of Schertz, Bexar County. Chenery.
Okay. So the applicants are proposing to replat an existing lot that makes up the Cullen subdivision. The proposal is to replat the existing lot and also add additional landing surrounding it that is currently unplatted in order to create a total of 3 residential lots, 2 of which would be newly created lots, and the existing lot would be reduced in acreage. Each lot is proposed to take access off Fowle Road. The subject property is located about 3,500 feet north of the intersection of Fowle Road and Interstate 10. And the subject property is zoned single-family residential agricultural district, RA, and currently has an existing single-family residence with some detached structures along the front of the subject site immediately off Fowle Road. The majority of the remaining portion of the property behind the existing home is currently undeveloped. Since this is a replat of a residential subdivision, it requires publication in a newspaper and mail out of notices to all owners of the lots in the original subdivision that are within 300 feet of the lots being replatted. So the public hearing notice was published in the San Antonio Express on April 5th, 2018, and one notice was mailed out to the owner of the replat request. No responses have been received. All 3 lots are designed to have direct access off File Road, and currently there's also an existing ingress-egress easement that provides access to all of the proposed lots. And on this exhibit here, this portion here, it's the area that's being replatted, and as you can see, there's this existing lot, which is the one and only lot that makes up the Colon subdivision that currently exists. And then portions of the surrounding unplatted property are included with this replat application to create a total of 3 residential lots. And just to orient you, where the cursor is here, this is File Road. And the 3 new residential lots would be lots 2, 3, and 4. The first lot is this one immediately off of File Road. Lot 3 is immediately behind Lot 2, and then again, Lot 4 is behind the first 2 lots I had just mentioned. And the total acreage is a little over 5 acres. The applicant is responsible for complying with the city's tree preservation and mitigation requirements. A tree affidavit was submitted, signed and notarized by both applicants, indicating that any protected or heritage trees on site will not be destroyed or removed. There is not any parkland that is being proposed within the subdivision, so a fee in lieu of parkland dedication for 2 new lots being created will be due prior to recording the plat. The site is serviced by City of Schertz for water, CPS for electricity, and Charter Communications and AT&T for telecommunications and internet. And this is within an area where, as Kathy had mentioned earlier, sewer would be serviced by Schertz and San Antonio River Authority. It's a dual service area. However, with the waiver that was requested and approved by your commission, it would enable the lots to be developed with an on-site septic facility. No public improvements are required for this subdivision. There's an existing 8-inch water line that runs along File Road, so the lots being proposed could tie into the existing 8-inch water line. With approval of the waiver, sewer extension and connection is not required. For drainage, the applicant's stormwater management plan was submitted, reviewed, and approved by our engineering department. Sidewalks along File Road are required and will need to be installed with future development of the newly created lots. No right-of-way dedication or improvements are required. Staff has reviewed the replat application, found that it is consistent with all applicable requirements for the property, and is recommending approval. And we have representatives here for the applicants, I should say.
All right, and then we'll open the public hearing at 6:19. We have a Mr. Brian Cullens that has signed up to speak. Would you like to make your comments, sir?
Yes, I actually signed up to talk about the subdivision. I was talking about the sewage, and you already approved the sewage, so that was the main thing I wanted to give in favor so they could have that for their house, and what that meant because sewer's not coming in. That was my main concern. This we're in approval of. The land is being reduced. That is so we're giving our land to Scott Ratman so that we won't have to manage it for ag anymore. He already manages and does that. So that's a formal thing that's happening here is our lot is being reduced. But we're in favor of that and aware of it now. So that's all I had to say about that. But I represent Carol Cullens, that's the applicant.
Okay, does anybody else have any comments to make? All right, we'll close the public hearing at 6:20. Commissioners.
I have a couple of questions, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
On the technical drawing, on the plat itself, over on the left-hand side, it talks about who owns what. Lot 1 is the Cullen subdivision owned by Carol Cullens, and then it says the owner of lots 2, 4, and 6 are Mr. Scott Rapmund. I don't see a lot 6, and what happened to lot 3?
One is the original subdivision before we split it before the subdivision.
See what I'm over on the right-hand side, where you come down, where the development, and you go on down, and it talks about the owners. I assume it's a typo, but
I believe that's a typo. That should be lots 3 and 4.
so it should be lots 2, 3, and 4. So educate me here. Can we? I mean, it's a tiny little thing, but is that something? Can we approve it?
It's a Scribner's error that can be
Yeah.
corrected in the meantime before final plat. However, let's finish our discussion.
My other question deals with ownership of the property. Again, I apologize. You know, I've been here for several months, but this is a first for me. Can I? It seems to me I'm replatting I'm replatting property that I don't own here. Okay.
So Mr. Rapman owns the portions of the subdivision that encompass what's currently unplatted. And, excuse me, and Ms. Carroll owns the existing Lot 1, which is being reduced and then, in essence, turning into Lot 2. So the property owners that make up the entire replat are the two that have signed the application.
Okay.
So Mr. Rathman and Ms. Collins are co-applicants on this.
Mr. Rapman and Ms.
Yes.
Carol Collins.
Okay.
Correct.
And then the intent is then all 3 lots will at some point become Mr. Rapman's property. Is that the intent?
I'm not sure what the intent is. When we process the applications, we just ensure that whomever the current property owners are, that they sign on with this current replat application.
Sure. Please come up and state your name and address for the record, please.
I have my husband, Scott Ratman, on the phone. He's overseas right now, so if I can't answer it, he may be able to answer it for you. The plot where it says Lot 3, that's actually owned by us. And then Lot 4, that's actually owned by us as well. And we're in the process of selling it to my niece, or actually kind of gifting it to her because she's going to be farming it. They have a permaculture farm. So we're replatting it so they can start their farm there. Does that help clear it up at all?
It does, but again, and I'm sorry if I'm just not seeing it. When I
That's
look
okay,
at
and I may not be understanding you clearly
well,
either.
when we look at the area to be replatted, the
Yes,
little
sir.
diagram up at the top, it looks like Ms. Cullens owns that all of Block 1, and then you folks own the piece that's being added to it.
Where it says Lot 2,
No.
in that smaller square, right there on File Road, that is Miss Cullens.
Yes.
And then right backed up to it is my husband's property.
Okay, but right now,
Yes.
the drawing that shows Lot 3, some of that right now belongs to Ms. Cullen.
Yes, and
Okay.
she has gifted that to my husband.
And so I'm just trying to, again, this is the first time I've come
Sure,
across something
sure.
like this, so I'm just trying to figure it out. So
We're learning
both
together.
parties have come in and asked for this, okay? And so what happens to the ownership after we redraw the lines? That's another issue? Yeah, okay.
Okay, thank you.
Right, in your statements, we say that all 3 lots will have access to File Road. And at this point, I can't find that annotated here on the plat itself. Doesn't say what it is. Doesn't say what it is.
So all 3 lots have frontage off File Road, which on this exhibit, so Lot 2 is immediately adjacent to File Road. There's an existing driveway there, so that has direct access off File Road. Lot 3 has a portion of Lot 3 that is proposed that shows a 20-foot wide frontage off File Road to be included as part of Lot 3. And then Lot 4 has...
Statement?
Yes.
That may be the proposal, but I'd like to know where it says that 20-foot belongs to Lot 3 and goes to File Road, because I can't find that in the notes. I can't find it annotated on the plat, so therefore it doesn't exist.
So it's not in the notes because it's depicted by the exhibit that shows the boundaries of Lot 3. So let me show with my cursor, and I know it's because the exhibit is small, so it's harder to see, but this is the back southerly portion of Lot 3, and I'm going to trace the cursor over it. It goes over about 200 feet wide, and then towards File Road, it's a distance of 570 feet, all the way up to the ultimate right-of-way. And then the portion of Lot 3 that is immediately accessible off File Road is a 20-foot wide portion of Lot 3. And then it traces back to 233 feet back, and then the remaining 180 feet of the 200-foot widest point of the lot then connects down all the way back to the portion that I had initially identified. So Lot 3, the term that a lot of people may hear of for this odd-shaped lot is like a flag lot. This area is zoned residential agricultural. There are no minimum or minimum lot widths or lot depth requirements for the RA zone, and so this odd shape that is being created is allowed by our zoning code for the RA zone district. And I'm
not arguing that it's allowed. I'm arguing that it is not identified properly. It doesn't say it's an easement. It doesn't say anything about what it's there for. And you have another one right beside it that you're trying to use to go all the way to Lot 4.
It would not be identified as an easement because it's part of the legal description of the entire lot.
It'd be covered by the meets and bounds, correct?
Exactly.
Yes.
Okay. There you go. I won't. That is not correct.
Why was only one notice mailed out when there's numerous property owners around it?
So this is one of those unique noticing requirements outlined by our Texas local government code that indicates that for a residential replat that this falls under, when the subdivision is being replatted, those that are required to be noticed are the owners of the original plat, so the original subdivision, which in this case, the original subdivision was comprised of only the one lot. And so Ms. Carol Collins was the only recipient of the notice because that was the only entity person that we were required to send a notice to. And then we published it in the San Antonio Express as well to fulfill the publication noticing requirements.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a motion that we approve the replat with the condition that the notes on the owners be corrected to reflect the correct lot numbers.
Okay, we have a motion by Commissioner Outlaw for PC 2018-002 for the replat. Do I have a second?
Second.
All right, motion by Outlaw, second by Commissioner Bro. Any other comments or questions, Commissioners? All right, we'll call for a vote.
Aye.
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 Nay.
Aye. Motion carries 5-1. All right, next item on the agenda, 5B, item ZC 2018-002. Hold a public hearing, consider and make a recommendation to City Council on an amendment of Part 3, Schertz Code of Ordinances, Unified Development Code, subsections in Articles 9 and 16 to amend certain site design standards for public water and wastewater facilities.
Evening, Commissioners. My name is Scott McClelland. I work in the engineering department as the project manager. We have a couple of capital improvement projects going on that are water and wastewater facilities. And as part of that, in the past for facilities like this, several variances have had to be passed to exempt those facilities from certain UDC requirements. So as we've been working on those projects, the planning and engineering staff have decided to try to make some exemptions in the UDC for these types of facilities. And so, as I mentioned in the past, these were exemptions that had to be done as variances. So to make to streamline the approval process, it seemed appropriate to make those exemptions in the UDC itself. Just to further define what we're actually describing, wanted to read what the definition was that we're proposing for public water and wastewater facilities, which will be added to Article 16. And it's any reservoirs, towers, tanks, pump stations, or other related appurtenances used for the purpose of providing potable water and wastewater utility service. Occupiable space is not considered a part of the public water or wastewater facility. So as you can see from the definition, we're talking about a very specific type of facility. So we're not opening ourselves up to a wide range of exemptions. Similar exemptions were done for public schools in the recent past. And so that's kind of the framework that we use for this. As you can see on your screens, these are the sections that we're proposing the exemptions in. So it's exemption to exterior construction and design standards, landscaping, screening and fencing, and then tree preservation and mitigation. Are there any questions on? Well, yeah.
I'd like to add something. So planning and engineering reviewed ways to exempt public water and wastewater facilities, and as we were looking at the UDC code sections, what we had looked at was in the past, and I think Scott may have mentioned it already, in the past for certain facilities, we were repeatedly processing variance applications that go to the Board of Adjustment. And an example would be one of our lift stations, the request for barbed wire fencing, because of the way the UDC is written, which generally speaking, the UDC code requirements are, a lot of the code requirements are more so for commercial and residential development that have certain architectural requirements. And so a good example is the Dietz Creek lift station to comply with the requirements for screening, or excuse me, for fencing around the facility. Barbed wire was being requested, and so staff had processed a variance for that. We also processed a variance application for barbed wire around the OJR site. And then a variance for exterior building material requirements, which we typically require masonry product. We processed a variance with the justification because of the operations of these facilities for sanitary purposes and for ease of maintenance. It made more sense to allow for non-masonry material. And so instead of continuously processing variance application requests where the hardship findings could potentially be difficult to make. It made more sense to propose UDC amendments that limit those exemptions to strictly public wastewater and water facilities, which is why we're also proposing this new definition, because we don't have a definition for public water and wastewater facilities. And so the bulleted list here is the list of proposed changes, which, like Scott said, the framework is similar to the exemptions that were processed and adopted for public schools.
All right, this will be a public hearing, so we'll open the hearing at 6:36. Anybody have any comments? Nope. All right, we'll close the hearing at 6:37. There, is that better? All right. Commissioners, comments, questions?
Well, Mr. Chairman, if I can start the discussion. Number one, I'm not a big fan of double standards where we have one set of rules for ourselves and a different set of rules for everybody else. In reading through the proposed changes, some of them, I can see the necessity for the building materials. Okay, we're talking about typically water treatment facilities, or we're talking about groundwater treatment and transport. But then I get to things like exempting them from the landscaping requirements. We're exempting them from landscaping their parking lot. We want to make them exempt from our tree mitigation and preservation ordinance. So this is one of those where I'm okay with part of it, and I wish I could go through here and just pick out those parts. So you can say, a parking lot's a parking lot. So if we're going to make HEB or Walmart put trees in their parking lot, why aren't we going to make the new sewer treatment plant put trees in their parking lot? If I'm going to put a business over here on Schertz Parkway and I have to plant trees along the road, why doesn't the water treatment plant have to plant trees?
May I address?
Please.
So we're not requesting an exemption from the street tree planting requirement, which is visible from the public right-of-way. All the landscaping that would be required would end up inside a facility that's bounded by an 8-foot masonry fence. Additionally, these facilities, by their very nature, are the equivalent to a water or wastewater utility easement, because that's their full purpose. And utility easements, I believe, are exempt from the tree mitigation and removal and preservation rules. So
I thought exactly. Okay, but here's another argument for you. When we were talking about making those changes to the tree preservation ordinance, we looked at things like a developer comes in with a master plan, or he's going to decide how he's going to lay out his facilities. He still has some, instead of putting the water pipe or the sewer pipe here, he moves it 5 feet one direction or the other. Can't my brand new, not yet built water treatment plant, don't they have the same flexibility? But in any case, Ms. Woodley, I realize that we changed the tree preservation to allow certain exemptions, and so I'm not sure that exemption needs to be here. I'd rather see them treated case by case rather than give them a blanket exemption.
Okay, and the primary types of facilities that are much more prevalent than the treatment plant would be lift stations, water tower site, where the intent is to keep that property as small as possible so as not to use up real estate for unnecessary space. So it's tight, space is tight on those kinds of sites. When we're talking about the treatment plant, that's a little bit bigger. And we purposely did include the plant, knowing that the developed area of those facilities is relatively small, even though it's a large piece of property overall. But we also didn't want to just do we're just writing this code specifically for our lift station and water tower site. Let's look at the thought behind it. It's actually for those types of facilities.
Yeah, no,
So-
that's the right, I agree with you. I think that's the right approach. If we're going to do it, you know, let's
just
take
for
yes, let's take the broader view. So,
The state also requires 250 feet or 200 yards between the plant and the any housing or development of any type. So we've got buku acres out there that we can't even use other than plant grass, which we do pretty good. We sell a lot of grass.
I see. You see some of these changes that are proposed also being in alignment with what we approved last year, with giving some relief to the schools and public facilities as well. I don't think that it's unreasonable. I would agree with Commissioner Outlaw. Struggling a little bit with the tree mitigation portion of it. Yeah, you can see the point that it is considered, you know, in essence, an easement, and they're pretty much exempt from it. But you know, that's one of those things that, as a community, we've prided ourselves on for a long time, that we go to lengths to protect, you know, those large heritage trees and protected class trees.
I wanted to add one point of clarification. So you'll notice that a lot of the sections that are proposed to be amended are within Article 9, which is the site development standards. We have additional site design standards that are tucked away in Article 14 for any properties that are off of primary and secondary arterials. One of the requirements in Article 14 is that trees along the street frontage be planted at a ratio of 1 tree per 20 linear foot of the frontage along the primary and secondary arterials. That is not being proposed to be changed, so any sites that come in to develop a public water or wastewater facility that are taking frontage, direct access off of primary or secondary arterial, those sites still have to comply with those tree planting and requirements. And so the modification being proposed for landscaping, the section that talks about landscaping in parking areas, 21.9.7H, a lot of the times when we think of the tree planting requirement along streets, generally speaking, for commercial lots, the parking is typically surrounding the building along the perimeter to make most efficient use of the space. And so the tree planting requirements that you typically see around the perimeter of commercial is a result of the parking being around the perimeter, so it requires tree planting, because our landscaping requirement in the parking area is so long as there's a vehicular use or parking area adjacent to a street, it requires tree planting at a ratio of 1 per 50 linear feet. And so for public water and wastewater facilities, generally speaking, they will hardly have any parking space requirements, if any even. And so while the proposal is to exempt this, generally speaking, parking spaces are not common to any of these facilities, with the exception of a treatment plant, where the parking would then be tucked in where the proposed facility is, and it would, good example is the South Schertz plant or the OJR site. It's far enough away from the public that the planting requirements associated with the parking for the facility would be so far away from the public right-of-way that it wouldn't even be visible.
And also, I'll just point out too, in general, that the facilities are not going to be open to the public either. You know.
Okay. So why are we doing? So we're doing trees not because we like trees and trees are good for the environment. We're doing trees because it makes everything look pretty. Is that what you're telling me? Because that's sure what I just heard.
Well, it's
Okay.
to also serve as, so for commercial areas where there's perimeter landscaping and tree planting requirements, it's to also prevent, in the evening when cars are driving by, the headlights, it's to
Yeah.
limit where the headlight is shined onto so that it doesn't spill over onto adjacent properties.
So then
So
you're.
it's more than
Okay.
just
So
make it
you're,
look pretty.
and I, trust me, I don't have the details up here, but parking lot landscaping, and maybe trees aren't required, maybe it's just the word landscaping, is only required, what, every 12 spaces or something like that, then you have to have that little place. So if our whatever we're calling these things, I'm sorry, if they've only got 10 parking spaces, then they wouldn't have to comply with this anyway. So why do I need to give them an exemption?
The language for the tree planting is, yes, you're correct, Mr. Outlaw. It's generally every 12 spaces, but the way the language is written, it's a planter island shall be provided every 12 stalls. And then there's also a code requirement that at the terminus of all parking rows, a tree shall be planted. So in the case of these public waste, so say these amendments do not go through and we're stuck where we have to abide by the existing UDC requirements, even if a public wastewater or water facility included only one parking stall, at the terminus of it, we require, because of the way the language is right now, we would actually require a tree be planted at the terminus of the parking row. That's only one stall, so we'd have to still require the trees be planted.
Okay, and I would agree that that would be a stupid requirement, okay, but I think we're going about this the wrong way, see? Because what you're asking for now is we're painting the whole thing with this broad brush that says if you're this kind of facility, you don't have to do any of this stuff, okay? So a guy, and again, I'm just plain devil's advocate, a guy come in here and for some reason he needs 50 parking spaces. Well, so he's exempt from all of that stuff. Okay, but so how do we not allow that, but not make him plant a tree because he's got one parking space? I agree that would be a dumb requirement, say, but I can't. I don't know how to do both. Okay,
But I think that's why we try to keep the definition as specific as we could, that the nature of any of these facilities is going to be a handful of parking spots at most, a wastewater plant probably being the most, but a lift station is going to be the most common out of any of these facilities listed, and those typically have, I'm not even sure if you could call it a parking spot, more of just a drive-in, and so I think that's what our approach was to make sure that it's a very narrow scope that while it seems like a broad brush, it's also for such a unique situation that was kind of our approach to control that.
and I get that. There's a difference between a lift station and a full-blown water treatment or wastewater treatment plant. And certainly I understand that something the size of a lift station, we aren't going to plant shrubs and trees. But again, I'm coming back to the same thing that these facilities are all in this one group. So there's no distinction in these requirements between, you know, a 100 square foot lift station and a 5 acre water treatment plant.
Would there ever be any administrative office space that would be proposed at the same site as a public water and wastewater facility?
So conceivably, a plant could include like office space. And so that is the reason that the definition, the very last sentence, talks about how occupiable space is not considered a part of the public water and wastewater facility. And with that proposal, so occupiable space is a definition within the building code that talks about any area that can be occupied by employees is essentially occupiable space. So the way these amendments are proposed, these exemptions would apply for the components that make up the facility itself, but the office use, if there were to be any office use proposed on these same properties as the facility, the office use or say a break room or anything like that, those are still subject to the same UDC standards that we currently have. They would not be exempt.
Different area. You mentioned barbed wire. When I think of barbed wire, I think of a rancher and miles of barbed wire to keep cows back. In this situation, I think what we're talking about is the barbed wire on top of a chain link fence for security.
Yes, sir.
Do we need to make the distinction between a rancher's barbed wire fence and a chain link fence, which is within our code and it's okay, and then adding the barbed wire on top for security purposes?
So currently the barbed wire on top of the chain link fence, the way staff interprets it with the current UDC without these amendments is that it would be prohibited on these facilities. Hence the reason why we had in the past processed a variance for the OJR site, for the Dietz Creek lift station, and a number of other stations that do have the barbed wire on top of the chain link fencing. It's staff's opinion that the way the language is written to the UDC amendments being proposed for this section that prohibits the material, it exempts the barbed wire requirement for public wastewater facilities so long as it's not visible from the public. We believe that covers the barbed wire on top of the chain link fencing.
Yeah, Mr. Broad, I interpreted that to mean, for instance, if you go out to the existing wastewater, the acreage itself is, I believe, is just it's barbed wire fencing. I don't think they have chain link running around the entire plant, and that's the way I interpreted this one.
They do now. But Dietz Creek is visible from the street, and it's got barbed wire for security reasons.
Yes, and that's to comply with TCEQ requirements. And also we did grant, the Board of Adjustment granted a variance to allow for that barbed wire fencing.
So would it still be, assuming this will be approved, would a waiver still be required? Let's say, well, the town creek is in Cibolo. If we did Dietz Creek someplace else, a waiver would still be required?
Would be required still, yes, because it is visible from a public right-of-way.
Why can't we make allowances for security reasons? The city may well be required to increase security around its water facilities, around water towers, around lift stations for the collection system. Security is becoming more and more important, and that's why I believe CCMA has taken those measures is for security reasons, to keep people out of the property. So instead of going for variances like we've been doing, can we make an allowance in here somewhere that says barbed wire for security purposes? on top of a chain link fence, if there's an official term for that, I don't know what the term is, but can we include that in here? So we don't have to continue with the variances. Because I'm pretty sure CCMA may be doing more of it in the future, and the city may well as also.
TCEQ does allow for an alternative to the barbed wire, which is instead of 6-foot chain link with barbed wire on top, an 8-foot intruder-proof wall or fence of some sort. So you'll see all the City of Schertz facilities. We have the Fencecrete 8-foot masonry walls around our facilities. We plan to continue to do that. And staff's opinion is that that's a better look, and it provides, in our experience, as much protection and security as the chain link with the barbed wire. So an argument could be made that that could be used in lieu of the chain link with barbed wire when it's visible from the public way. So we may not actually in the future support the granting of a variance for that sort of material in a location such as that.
Maybe I'm wrong, but I seem to recall that the lift station on 1518 in Womanhollering Creek, it's got the Fencecrete wall, but it also has some strands of barbed wire on the top of it as well.
It may. That's before my time.
So, all right, does anybody have anything else? All right, take your time.
Can you help me understand paragraph G on page 2, where it talks about an 8-foot masonry fence? If we use the example of OJR and use the example of the proposed southern plant that I think you guys have been looking at as far as a plat proposal, where would the 8-foot masonry fence be required in those two instances? It's not clear to me from reading item number 2, paragraph number 2.
Okay, so I think I understand your question, Mr. Bro. So we have landscaping requirements for any non-residential use that is immediately adjacent to residential use or residential zoned property. And one of the landscaping requirements is that a buffer be provided, and it's under G1, that's the existing code. It requires a 30 linear foot landscape buffer. Within that landscape buffer, 10 shrubs are required to be planted for every linear feet of landscape buffer, and then the requirement for the trees within that landscape buffer is 1 shade tree for every 30 linear feet, or excuse me, I jumbled that up. The landscape buffer, the distance between the non-residential use and the residential use, is a 20-foot buffer requirement. Within the 20-foot buffer requirement, there's tree planting requirements and shrub planting requirements within the buffer. And that ratio for the planting is 1 shade tree for every 30 linear feet along that portion that is immediately adjacent to the residential use or residential zone property. And then the shrub requirements is 1 shrub for every 50 linear feet. And so the proposed amendment is number 2, the portion that's in red and underlined. For any public water and wastewater facilities, the proposal is to the buffer requirement, the 20-foot buffer requirement is still in place. The requirement to plant the trees and the shrubs would not be required so long as, in lieu of those planting, those vegetation plantings, an 8-foot masonry fence is provided along that buffer area. And so the logic behind that is, for these lift stations, like you had mentioned, there's Fencecrete that surrounds it. rather than planting trees and shrubs within that fenced area, we believe that the fence in lieu of the landscaping is adequate to serve as a buffer, and the buffer distance of 20 feet is still preserved.
So I guess to answer the question about specifically the OJR and the south plant, probably doesn't affect either of those because the facility is going to be set back from the property lines. So this would be more for those lift stations that we're in potentially 3 sides have that residential boundary, and so we're going to have our masonry wall out there towards the property line to maximize the property. Whereas opposed to if you have a larger property, that 20-foot buffer becomes less of a requirement to where that fence or that wall wouldn't be as big of a deal.
So at OJR is surrounded by the creek, by Cibolo Creek, and then by residential areas.
Yes.
But the plant itself wouldn't be considered immediately adjacent to residential areas,
No,
right?
it's
Because there's
such a
a large enough buffer zone in there.
Yes. And so
The same thing for the south plant. The proposed south plant, okay.
And so because of the TCEQ requirements for distancing of how close they can be compared to residential, it almost makes that 20-foot landscape buffer a moot point, because to comply with the TCEQ requirements, those facilities are already providing that buffer.
Okay, as they say, the devil is in the details. Define near. Okay, I mean, I'm not trying to be facetious here. I'm trying to be, we need to have enforceable rules, and help me out here. When we build, for instance, that new doctor's office that went up on the corner of Savannah and Church Parkway, he was required to put that masonry fence between his property and the residential behind him. Well, is there still a 20-foot buffer there?
Yes, there's still a 20-foot buffer there. So that medical facility was required to provide the buffering with the landscaping.
So we're requiring them to landscape inside their 8-foot masonry fence, right? Am I missing something?
You can see the landscaping from
Okay, I got you.
right of way.
And again, there's a difference. I understand when we're dealing with a couple hundred square feet. Okay. But I really am serious about when I see terms like, where you say is provided at the property line, that's pretty clear cut. But when you say near the property line, who gets to decide, is 5 foot near, is,
These proposed amendments have come about because of projects that are underway or will be underway soon, correct? I think for me, and this is just a comment, it would be really helpful, especially in making decisions where we are making, I think, relatively large changes, would be to see those site plans. I think, especially if we have a project underway, so that I know what I'm deciding about now, but also I do have some concerns about the future, and where any of these, the definitions of these public water and wastewater facilities might be in the future, and then they're exempted from all of these landscape requirements and buffer.
I've got 2 items. Those of us who've been on the commission for a while will recall the discussion that happened when the modifications to Clemens came about. The new Rose Garden on 1518 was being planned, and the Comal County schools went up without any approval for anything. Approvals after the fact, if I'm not mistaken. all this discussion came up, and part of the discussion was from city staff was we're spending public money, public taxpayer money to build schools. The schools would rather not comply with all the nice to have, pretty, happy to glad, plant trees, plant flowers, have landscape buffers, and have all this stuff because they need all the money to get the most bang for the buck for the kids. And so there was a lot of disagreement up here on the commission, but we gave in saying, well, you know, a lot of the schools are under construction right now and it's too late to make them stop and go back and redesign. And yeah, we want to do it for the kids, so we made the wholesale changes. Some of that argument can be transferred to public wastewater and public water facilities because, again, it's taxpayer money, whether it be direct taxes or bonds or whatever. Taxpayer money is being used for these projects. You want to get the most bang for the buck, and you don't want to spend it on things like flowers and trees and bushes and, you know, beautifully landscaped parking lots. It's not necessary. You want the most money possible to be spent on the equipment. So that was the argument for the schools. The wastewater company, the wastewater authority has been having numerous requests for changes and waivers and so on and so forth. And so city staff is coming back to us and saying, let's just make all these waivers for public water and wastewater just like we did for the schools. So that's partly why this came about, and a little bit of a history, I think, on where this came about. So what's good for the schools, a public facility, ought to be good for water and wastewater, public facilities. And I think the city would do the same for city facilities. They're not going to spend a lot of money on beautification and following all these codes either. The city can basically do whatever it wants. So I'll leave it at that. Another item to consider is, I know a point of contention in the Dietz construction project was wooden power poles versus metal. I think that's coming up in the OJR design. Can we include that in this waiver process as well to let whatever is appropriate to be used rather than the city demanding one or the other? Can we include that in here, that if wood is appropriate to use wooden poles?
I would say we might not want to add that into this package of amendments, but it is something that we have considered bringing back to planning and zoning, because my understanding is that this body made the change to, and the conscious decision to go with the metal poles instead of wooden poles. And we have had requests, particularly from GVEC. I know CPS doesn't like it, but they're resigned to the fact that they're putting in metal poles everywhere. But they would much rather use the wooden poles. And there are pros and cons to both, but the understanding was that it was made for an aesthetic purpose. If both types of poles can do the job, what's left is the looks of the thing. So we were going to work with those utility companies to find out the answers to those questions, and would they like to proceed with requesting that we modify the ordinance in that case. But it's kind of a bigger, to me, that's a bigger picture item, because it's not very narrowly focused to the types of facilities that are either very, very small and tucked into a residential area or a commercial or industrial area, or a treatment plant, which is kind of its own sort of animal that has some development kind of plopped down in the middle of an otherwise undeveloped space. So the utility pole question, we may want to take a broader look at that, but understood that that is something that you would like to revisit. Right. But we're looking to.
So what we have here is this discussion on these proposed amendments for potential facilities that are similar to the schools, which we've already granted similar type waivers. The wastewater facilities, typically are not going to be open to the public. It's, I guess, a little asking a lot in some of these categories. I think that, you know, again, going back to the tree mitigation, I'm really struggling with that aspect of it myself. But the rest of it seems reasonable, and generally I would feel that we could go with staff's recommendation on this. But you know, it's pretty significant policy change. And again, as all the other things that we go through and we discuss and we make changes, none of these changes necessarily have to be permanent and engraved in granite. That they can come back in a year and give us a report on what we've seen, what we're experiencing, and if we need to, we can go back and tweak it a little bit more.
Part of the problem, and we went through this many years ago, that if you constantly going back to the Board of Adjustment, something's wrong in your book somewhere, and it needs to be changed. And obviously the staff has got going back to BOA, I guess, pretty regular for changes and waivers and stuff. I don't see any need for it. If we can make some changes here, we can work on the polls later on. I know CCMA has got a problem with it because of expense. The money we got from the state is not enough to cover everything that's wanted in the city's books. But the majority of the people that get the service will never see that plant. We service Schertz, Cibolo, UC, part of Live Oak, Randolph Air Force Base, a whole bunch. Nobody's going to go want to tour the sewer plant, at least not to my knowledge, although I did go. And anybody wants to tour the water plant in Nixon, 4th of May, from 8 in the morning till noon, they are giving a tour. Now that's something you want to see, although 90% of it you can't see because it's all buried.
All right, commissioners, any other comments, questions?
Question. What do you mean by coming back to revisit the poll issue? Revisit in this environment, or revisit in what way?
Probably in this environment to sort of gauge what your feelings are on the poll, and look at where we might want to specifically allow alternative materials for the poll instead of just leaving it up to a case-by-case basis. I think right now it's written into the code as an administrative allowance. The city manager has the authority to allow the wooden poles under certain circumstances. But if we want to change the code to actually specifically allow alternative materials in certain cases, we need to really look at that on a broader scope than just...
Because part of our earlier discussion mentioned that specifically in the OJR and in the South Regional Plant application, they're going to be so far from the road and so far from sight distance and so far from public view, which is a reason the city wants to put metal poles, is for aesthetic reasons. In those two instances, wooden poles would be so far out of view, it wouldn't even be visible, so it wouldn't even matter to anyone. And so the feeling I'm getting is the city is resisting the application of wooden poles at OJR. And the city has the ultimate power to say yes or no. To me, it doesn't matter. It's not in view of the public. So my question is, why can't we put it in this modification? Or why is the city so uptight about metal poles in places that are out of public view?
That's a very good question.
Yeah.
So as far as adding an exemption for the requirement for metal utility poles at locations outside view from, not visible from the public way, we can certainly add that. I hesitate to add something without having thought it through, because what if we've just opened something, it's not visible from the public way, but there's a thoroughfare on our thoroughfare plan 100 feet behind that. So I would appreciate us being able to go back and look at the potential ramifications of that before we just throw it into something.
Mr. Chairman, I move that we table this item and let the staff go back and look at the metal pole versus wood pole issue and bring this item back to us at a future date.
Okay, we have a motion to table. Do we have a second?
Second.
All right, motion to table by Mr. Bro, second by Mr. Greenwald. Any other comments or questions?
I'm sorry, just a question again. Since the ultimate result is we make a recommendation for or against and send it to City Council, can we in fact table something without can we say no, we're not going to look at it right now, come bring it back to us, and then how does that affect? Can you understand?
I guess my understanding of it is that when it's a published public hearing, we've complied with the law on that, and we've held the public hearing. Correct, Mr. Attorney? And so at that point, how we dispose of it is up to our discretion. We can make the recommendation to approve. We can make a recommendation to approve with modifications. We can make a motion to disapprove, or we can table. So we have a motion and a second to table to give staff some opportunities to look at the wooden versus metal pole discussion. And if there's anything else that anybody else wants us to revisit, that we can also bring that in and have staff work on it and bring it back to us at a later date. Any other comments, questions? All right, call for a vote on the motion to table.
Aye.
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 Nay.
Aye.
Aye. Motion carries 5-1.
All right, we'll bring this back with information about the wooden poles. We'll bring some sample site plans and talk about the potential for future facilities that would fall under these same rules. Anything else
I think that'll
you're
about
looking to
cover
add?
it.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
All right, next item on the agenda, requests and announcements. Request by commissioners to place items on future agenda. Commissioners. I think we got that covered. All right, announcements by commissioners. City community events attended, to be attended. Continuing education events attended and to be attended. Anybody have anything?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I attended the Committee of Committees Advisory Board meeting. He represented the Planning and Zoning Council, and the staff has provided you with the discussions items from that meeting.
And I'll mention I went to the volunteer fair, had a pretty good turnout there, had some good discussions with some people there and stuff, and so it's really nice that Brenda's putting that on. Announcements by staff. Nothing. All right, site plan applications, nothing there. All right, with that said, we'll call the meeting adjourned at 7:20.